There's a section in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which I think is necessary to analyze in order to understand certain figures of kind of radical self-preservation, such as the multimillionaire aging activist, or anti-aging activist, I should say, Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson is somebody who's at the forefront of experimenting in methods of anti-aging. He's a sort of influencer and promoter of these mechanisms, and his goal is to try to live as long as possible, or if it was in his power, perhaps stop aging altogether. I'm going to argue in this video that this desire to use health, the kind of knowledge of modern health sciences, medical sciences, in order to stop aging or slow down aging as much as possible, is a kind of symptom or a fundamental characteristic of the last man. This is something I fundamentally disagree with when it comes to an association of Nietzsche and the Übermensch with different forms of contemporary transhumanism. I think contemporary transhumanism is a kind of stage in the history of the last man, not a expression of the Übermensch. This is a larger point, and perhaps it will make more sense by the end of the video. So let's start with quoting a section from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In this section, which is titled "Of the Virtue That Makes Small," Zarathustra wanders past what is basically a neighborhood, a row of houses, and his rhetoric is, I think, somewhat applicable to a figure such as Brian Johnson. So he says, "What do these houses mean? Truly no great soul put them up as its image. Did a silly child perhaps take them out of its toy box, if only another child would put them back in its box? And these sitting rooms and bedrooms, are men able to go in and out of them? They seem to be made for dolls, or for dainty nibblers who perhaps let others nibble with them." And Zarathustra stopped and considered. At length he said, sadly, "Everything has become smaller. Everywhere I see lower doors. Anyone like me can still pass through them, but he has to stoop." At first glance, this passage may seem peculiar, ambiguous, and maybe even irrelevant. But I think what stands out to me when thinking about someone like Brian Johnson is the fact that he's sort of like a doll, that he's trying to be a doll, that he sort of looks like a doll and behaves like a doll, and his life ambition to become this sort of medically managed, aging, negating, death averting kind of being sort of reminds me of a doll, because a doll doesn't die, a doll doesn't age, a doll doesn't go through the biological processes of life. And even on a aesthetic level, I think that there's a similarity, an uncanny similarity of appearances there. What we should also recognize in this passage, and this is common throughout Nietzsche's work in general, is that Nietzsche is criticizing a sort of more holistic social, educational, and psychogenic conditioning process, which modern civilizations tend to have sort of created, which makes people smaller. It makes people less distinct, less imposing, less threatening, less memorable, I think we could say also. These little doorways and hallways and low doors that make a man have to stoop to enter inside can be seen, I think, as a general kind of architectural, social architectural house that we adapt ourselves to and fit it ourselves into in order to create, in order to cultivate ourselves and design ourselves in a certain way. This is what the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk would call auto-domestication. Human beings are anthropologically creatures that domesticate themselves to a large extent. And Nietzsche can be seen, I think, as one of the great polemicists against a certain sort of auto-domestication, one which was, in a sense, crippling us, making us stoop, making us smaller. To refer to the German sociologist Norbert Elias, who I've frequently referred to on this channel, who wrote the book The Civilizing Process, we see this, there is a tendency to condition ourselves into a certain ideal, condition ourselves into a certain image or a certain definition of what human beings should be like, which emerges through the processes of domesticating and civilizing ourselves, and of course then domesticating and civilizing each other. Elias was particularly interested in the historical period of the early modern era of absolute courts. So this was a time when the warrior nobility, who I think Nietzsche would have been quite sympathetic towards, was displaced by a courtly nobility who created a kind of social conditioning process, at least at the time for the elites, not necessarily for everybody. That came later with the bourgeoisie, but at the time for the elites, in which to be well-mannered and well-civilized and to lack certain maybe impulsive instincts, particularly instincts which you might associate with a warrior caste, more aggressive, more warlike characteristics and impulses, to lack these and to be well mannered and so forth, was in the period of absolute courts became a sort of psychogenic, as Elias would refer to it, standard for human behavior. The elites slowly became defined by this courtly behavior and courtly psychology, and of course all the courtly social relations that go along with that. And it's frequent and common today, and I think it is a testament to how historically kind of ignorant we are, that you do see a lot of people who are nostalgic for example, aristocracies, or nostalgic for monarchies, or nostalgic for traditional authority, who don't make the distinction at all between the knightly warrior elites and the courtly. This is an important distinction to make because this time period is very much one of the most important periods, one of the most important changes in how we associate a good or a noble or a civilized person, the standard, the ideal human, radically changed in that time. And history since then has been largely informed by this change, which most people are completely unaware of. So how does Brian Johnson, of all people, fit into this, early modern period of elite culture wars between the warriors and the courtly types? Well, the emergence of medical science, in particular biotechnology, or anything associated with biotechnology, anything which can alter ourselves on a fundamentally genetic and therefore ontological level, should be seen as a part of the history of auto-domestication. It should be seen as a part of a new sort of technology, one which is far more powerful than any other form of socialization which has ever existed, which can give us power to design a new human being according to what is most of the time deeply ideological and historically particular ideals about how humans should be. Brian Johnson should be seen as one of many potential archetypes of auto-domestication within the era of advancing medical technologies. Brian Johnson is someone who is ultimately asking us to embrace, relatively blindly embrace, the potential power of new medical sciences and technologies, which can interfere with and manage and manipulate us on a genetic level. The capacity to slow down the aging process, for example, is one of those potential new powers of the era of auto-domestication on a kind of biotechnical level. But what Brian Johnson reveals to us is a modern subjectivity which is less reaching for the stars and is more stuck in the dollhouse, so to speak. Auto-domestication is a high-stakes, risky, and deeply political terrain to walk upon. There's a few different kind of propagandistic ways to think about something like anti-aging technology. One can say it's simply an inevitable step in the progress of human beings, in the technological, social progress of human beings. One can say it's merely practical. It's merely to stop aging, which causes things like sickness or death, and that it's merely a practical medical technology and so forth. One can just use the kind of stupid utilitarian brain and just say aging and death are bad, therefore we avoid these things. Simple as that. If we have the power to do that, let's do it. But what all of these arguments fail to acknowledge is the ontological alteration of the human being into something which may be deprived of other things, not just aging and death, for example, or the aversion or the delaying of aging and death, but may be deprived of certain characteristics which have always made him who he is. So if you think about a doll, if you ask the simple question of what is a doll, well, it's a sort of thing. It exists. It's shaped like a human being. It's in the image of a human being, but it lacks two dimensions which the human being has always had within him. One is animal nature, instincts, biology. A doll's plastic. It's mass produced. It doesn't have a kind of biological existence. It doesn't have a natural existence. It doesn't age, but it also doesn't grow. It doesn't get sick, but it also doesn't have the sorts of benefits and strengths of living creatures and animals. Strength, power, movement, instinct, intuition, and so forth. These animal characteristics are something in which the civilizing process does try to regulate and manage within a modern civilization. As psychoanalysis teaches us, there's a repressive constraint on certain instincts and impulses which are at least somewhat part of our biological existence. Urban, economic, technologically advanced human life is largely alienated from and restrictive towards what we could call animal nature. But it gets more complicated than this. A doll is not just alienated from animal nature. A doll is alienated from transcendence, from spirit, from spiritual, from anything spiritual, from any sort of spiritual existence or connection. In fact, the only depiction in film or literature of a doll which is animated, insofar as that it's given the capacity to think and move like a living creature, is in the realm of the demonic. So, for example, Chucky, the film Chucky, when a evil spirit comes back to life through possessing a doll and goes around killing people. A doll does not contain the religious, spiritual, or transcendental components that human beings always have. So on one level, the dollhouse, the doll as an ideal human archetype to aspire to, is appealing, I think, to certain urban, technologically inclined, kind of complex civilizational ideals around civilizing us away further and further from our animal nature, as a doll is fully alienated. It's almost the most fully alienated stage from animal nature. But it's also particularly appealing, the doll as a sort of ideal is particularly appealing to atheists, positivists, a sort of scientism, a sort of reductive scientific view of human beings as purely biological or purely neurological, purely material creatures. And on a political level, given that liberalism has always been a political system which tries to avert the potentially warlike and potentially conflict-prone potentialities to religious creatures, for example, the wars between Protestants and Catholics and Christians and Muslims and so forth. The conflict-prone aspect to the transcendental, in which humans get caught up in potentially violent conflicts over metaphysical and religious claims, this is also not something which is possible within the doll. The doll doesn't have that conviction towards the transcendental. It doesn't have that spiritual component. So the doll is appealing, actually, to many people in contemporary society. It's appealing to the technologically inclined. It's appealing to liberalism on a kind of fundamental political sense. It's appealing to materialist positivists. And I think that a kind of radical demand for self-preservation is a fitting motivation to initiate the doll as a new archetype of human existence, a new possibility, a new standard we can model ourselves on. Because within this injunction, this demand for radical self-preservation, a life which orientates itself around avoiding death or anything which might bring us closer to death, is something which I think averts the intrinsic potentiality of death within biology, because biological creatures all die. But equally, or even more importantly, it averts the spiritual dimension of having something to die for. The death of the spiritual puts us into this situation where, with the advancements of such technologies of anti-aging or genetic manipulation and so forth, puts us into a situation where we're going to have to make a decision between an indefinite loss of human beings in the symbolic sense, in the spiritual sense, in the sense of humanity as defined as something which is a being which is more than an animal, and certainly more than a piece of plastic which has been sculpted in a certain way. Are we willing to give up the definition of humanity and the identification of the human as something which is in some sense spiritually higher, or at least contains a higher potentiality within it? Are we willing to ontologically lower ourselves to the standard of a piece of plastic, which is even lower than an animal, in order to guarantee indefinite self-preservation? Is that really a good trade-off? If you ask that question to any human beings, pretty much anywhere in any time of human history other than the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years, they would have said, no way. It's absolutely not a good trade-off. We'll die. We'll accept death. And be humans. But that would be to undermine, to assume that that is going to be indefinitely the continued answer, the most popular answer, the most dominant answer to that question, I think would underestimate the power of the kind of psychogenic conditioning forces which have civilized us into something which is increasingly looking something like a doll. It would be underestimating the power of the doll house. It would be ignoring the historical catastrophes of the death of God and the loss of any sort of higher pursuit which can draw humans beyond their mere demands for biological self-preservation, material self-preservation, into something more. It would be deeply underestimating the history and the conditioning processes which have put us in the position where someone like Brian Johnson can exist to begin with.